Welcome to my webinar, 7 Steps to Create a Cool Outdoor Haven. I'm Edwina Robinson, landscape architect and founder of the Climate Factory. I started the Climate Factory in 2019 after Canberra had sweltered through its hottest summer on record. You can connect with me on social media. My mission is to empower people to create cool outdoor havens that help them cope with heat waves. So cool outdoor havens, not only in their back gardens, but on their nature strips and in their streets and in local parklands. My vision is to plant 100,000 climate-ready trees and shrubs in Canberra by 2025. So heat waves are going to be more common in the future and impact us all. Most at risk are the under 5s, the over 65, the chronically ill, as well as people with mental health conditions, outdoor workers, athletes, and rates of domestic violence also increase. So not only do heat waves make us limp, they also make our plants in our landscapes limp. So a discussion of heat waves can't be had without talking about our housing stock. So our housing stock is pretty poor in many parts of our city, or at cities plural, often poorly designed with little solar orientation, little insulation. And the people who are in those places are often renters and people in lower socioeconomic groups who actually can't afford to stay cool. So I wanted the proof. I wanted to get proof to prove that trees actually reduce temperatures. So I'd been reading statistics that trees could reduce temperatures beneath them from anywhere between 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. So in January 2019, I took along some thermometers to the Botanic Gardens in Canberra. And I measured a series of temperatures. So when I got out of the car, I measured the air temperature in the shade in the car park, which was 37 degrees. On the concourse, by the concrete concourse by this water feature, it was 34 degrees. But once I descended down into the rainforest gully in the Botanic Gardens, something really special had happened. So the temperature was 11 degrees cooler than the bitumen car park. It was only 26 degrees. And I reason that that's partly due to all this dense layering of vegetation, but also the application or the careful application of water through a creek gully and misting and careful irrigation, as well as the creation of really good soil. Now, when this idea was first proposed to create a rainforest gully in what had been a dry type gully dominated by eucalyptus forest, a number of people were really skeptical. But the way they created this was they used a whole lot of fast-growing overstory plants like eucalyptus and wattles, which actually enabled a lot more sensitive plants to be grown below them. So this has given me some ideas towards creating cool outdoor spaces. I'm not suggesting you replicate the rainforest gully, just take inspiration from it. So there's 7 principles I'm going to talk to you about. Knowing your future climate. So what's your future climate going to be like in a climate change scenario? Harvesting water and celebrating water. Building great soil. So there's much we can do to build our soils and not let them be blown away. To plant densely, grow in containers. If you don't have your own garden or if you're renting, you can still do this in containers. I also want to talk to you about the idea of nourishing yourselves, but also nourishing wildlife. And lastly, if you, in summertime, cook outdoors, you're going to keep a lot of the heat outside. And I think that's a great idea. So in 2016, my partner Peter and I bought a long, weedy block of land in Moruya, New South Wales. Moruya is based on the south coast, so we're about 6 to 7 kilometres inland, and we have a small creek that runs sometimes along the block. Predominantly when I'd visited this place, it was, notwithstanding this December where all the grass is browned off, it was a very lush looking place. So we designed a solar passive, small, affordable, comfortable house with an associated outdoor space on this block of land. And this is, I'm going to be taking the examples from our block to illustrate the principles that I'm talking about. So here we are there with one of our dogs, Finbar. and you can probably tell from this image is we really like gardening. Well, particularly I really like gardening. I find it a fantastic way to wind down. So here's a sketch plan I created for what was going to be our micro oasis or outdoor haven. So if you're ever lucky enough to build your own house and garden, it's a great opportunity to do these two things at the same time. Excuse me. So what we wanted to do was to create what was essentially an outdoor room that extended out from our living area and from our bedroom. Both of these face north. This space would capture the northern sun, particularly important in winter time, but it was also bounded here. We have planted very densely to the west to create a windbreak. And yeah, so I mentioned the access to the living room is really important. So these are some of the things you can think about when you're creating an outdoor space. So this first principle is really important, knowing your future climate. So I mentioned that we bought the block in 2016. Well, 2019 was a shock. We'd only received 508 millimetres of rain for the entire year. Our rainwater tank, which is 23,000 litres, was empty. And on the 31st of December, fire hit our region. So Mogo and Cobargo went up in flames on the 31st of January. So it was a shock to me to see this landscape that I'd considered relatively lush to be so dry, and the landscape I'd created in danger. Many of the plants were in danger of dying from lack of water. We'd also had quite severe water restrictions imposed by that time. By contrast, a couple of months later, we were experiencing flood. So we had around 200 millimetres of rain over maybe a 10-day period, and you can see the results of this. So our neighbour, who is a market gardener, a lot of his vegetables ended up in our block and downstream. So they're actually pumpkins and zucchinis and tomatoes floating down the creek. But importantly is to know your future climate is to have a look at the Australian government's climate analogue tool. And I'll show you more of this in the next slide. What I've done is input it into the various modelling scenarios. For 2050, an emissions scenario of 8.5, that's a worst possible scenario. That's pretty much if we do nothing. And also the hottest and driest I've selected. I think it's much better to be prepared for the worst in terms of our landscapes, because our landscapes can play such an important role in helping keeping us cool. So if we look at the ACT, we've already had in the ACT, and actually Australia is already, temperatures have already risen by 1 degree Celsius, but we can see that over the next 30 years there's predicted to be a significant rainfall decrease of 20%. But what this model provides, which I really like, is it gives some reference climates that you can look at to see what the climate might be like. So for example, in this one for 2050, Maitland or Curry. And what you can do with that information is then you can look up those places and find out what does the council recommend are the trees and shrubs that are useful for planting in those places. What do the local wholesale growers, what do they grow for that climate? So it gives you a really good idea of what are the trees that we can plant in the future. Trees are our longest lived part of our landscape, and it's really important that the trees we plant in the ground are the right tree for the right place, and that those trees are climate ready. So I'd really recommend you go on to that tool and play around with the various scenarios to see what your climate and what places your climate might be, or towns your climate might be like in the future. So I mentioned this principle a bit like the Botanic Gardens, harvest and celebrate water. So what we've tried to do in our courtyard is we have this small pond built into the courtyard. It has a cascade that we can turn on and off. The water is filled up from our we fill this up from our rainwater tank. We can experience this, the sound of this pond and the look of the pond from our bedroom here, as well as when we're in our micro oasis. It's a place of goldfish. Occasionally a frog comes and makes a home in that stone wall, which is actually can be quite annoying in the evening. We've got a place for frogs elsewhere. But yeah, harvest water. One of the things after 2019, the shock of 2019, how hot and dry and how much of our landscape burnt, was I came across this book on rainwater harvesting by Brad Lancaster. I can highly recommend it. This one, volume 2 in particular, is about earthworks and how you can do these really simply with spades. And I've actually taken quite a few of his ideas on board. So here, I showed you the image earlier. Should I just scroll back? So we've got our rainwater tank here that collects rainwater from not only our house and our shed, so we have about 200 square metres of roof space that collects this water. But then we have overflow pipes that go underground that feed into the frog pond and then overflow into a second overflow pond and then eventually down into the creek. So there's me with the frog pond number 1. So this was quickly colonised by frogs and other water bugs. When I say frogs, I should say tadpoles, because the frogs just lay their eggs in the water and occasionally use the water, but don't live in the water permanently. They usually find them in the, in amongst the mulch or the plants in that area. The thing that's been really fantastic, particularly after that February rainfall event, was that this filled up. And then these plants in the bed behind it, the water wicks up from the soils through capillary action. So we don't line these ponds. They're actually, this one's just created in a clay area and it's pretty good at holding water, but does evaporate and dry out at different times of the year. But what we're finding is it's particularly useful for the plants behind it. So these are a whole lot of wattles that are probably maybe only 18 months old, but are at least 3 metres in height. Also, if you're harvesting water and celebrating it, think about having some permeable surfaces. We tend in our urban environments to concrete or pave over everything. Much better if we can get the water infiltrating into the ground, back into our soils and back into our waterways. The thing I've learnt from Brad Lancaster's book, and you can see those 2 images there of the convex versus the concave slope. The convex slope is how I'd instructed the earth-moving contractor to create our landscape for us when we were cutting a site, cutting the area for the building to go on. And so I said, oh yes, we just want to create all these mounds so we can create interest on the block. Well, what I did is I created conditions for water to shed very rapidly off the soil rather than to be captured in the soil. So convex slopes are okay in very heavy rainfall environments, but not so okay when we're starting to look at increased periods of drying. So think about how can you capture the water and how can you hold it in your landscape. So I want to share with you how we've created really good soil at our place, and we continually build soil. We also try and integrate collecting organic material into our lifestyle. So that's easy enough for us to do. We only work part-time, but I'll share with you what we do. So our day often starts with the walk on the beach, and in New South Wales you're allowed 20 litres per person of seaweed per day, and however you're not allowed to take seaweed from national parks or marine parks. So often we take the seaweed home. We might dry it out on the grass, so we'll just spread it out on the grass and then run the mower over it. So then that breaks it up into quite fine particles that we can add to compost, or if we're making a garden bed, we'll just layer it. So I also use cardboard if I'm suppressing kikuyu, and then I'll add layers of organic material on top of that and just allow that to break down. But okay, so once we've been to the beach, we then go and have a coffee at our local coffee shop. They often have the coffee grounds, steamed coffee grounds, bagged up at the back of the shop. We take them home, we add them to our compost. By the way, if you're into mushroom growing, this is a great sort of substrate to grow on. Saves you having to go through that step of having to pasteurize a substrate. We also have 4 chickens, so we throw them all our food scraps, and then they in turn produce amazing eggs for us and amazing manure. We also have the showground nearby, so actually after the fires we had fantastic amounts of horse poo, because a whole lot of horses were kept at the showground for a long time as people were escaping the threat of fire, or maybe their properties were already fire affected. So there's an image on the top of us actually mowing over the seaweed. And once we've added all these organics to the soil, which we'll be then adding to soil carbon and creating a much greater sponge in the soil to hold water, we also add mulch. So I tend to buy mulch in bulk. So I'll get 6 cubic metres delivered, and it may take me a couple of weeks to apply a 50 to 75 millimetre layer on top of my garden beds. And I always make sure my garden beds are moist before I apply it. So don't apply mulch to dry soil, because it'll be really hard to get moisture into your soil. So planting densely, like the Botanic Gardens, you know, I'm not suggesting you should be replicating a rainforest gully in your outdoor haven, but asking you to think about planting densely. And I've got a couple of examples here on our block. This first example on the left-hand side is what I call a microforest, so a dense pocket of climate-ready vegetation. I've tried to mimic the local sand dunes, and I've used some very fast-growing plants, so acacias, alocasuarinas and casuarinas as the upper story layer. These tend to be growing very fast. Some of them have reached 4 metres in 3 years. They'll probably die fast as well. But as they go through their life cycle, they're also dropping lots of organic material and adding to that layer of organics over the soil and self-mulching in a way. So underneath this is a series of other trees, shrubs and ground covers that are creating a whole series of layers in that landscape. Now this acts as a windbreak. It's to our west, so it's helping with those hot westerly and northwesterly winds, as well as privacy issues to the street. Bottom right example, by contrast, is what I call a food forest. It's a 5 by 5 metre area, densely planted with food plants. So mostly food plants, I should say. There's a couple of wattles in there. But those food plants are a mix of exotics and natives. So the native ground cover we've got growing in there is warrigal greens, which is almost like a weed here. And a weed's just a plant in the wrong place. So what we're trying to do is plant really densely, and this will change over time, and that's okay. That's what happens in nature. Natural forests, natural ecosystems change over time, and that's really, really okay. What we're trying to do is to have very little bare soil. So because if you have bare soil, there's very little microbial life in it. So you really want to cover that soil with mulch. The only exception is if you have pardalotes in your area. Pardalotes are a very sweet little bird. They like to make burrows in sort of mounds of soil. So you might like to encourage them in your garden. The bottom right or the middle example is from above our micro oasis. So you can see there, above a stone wall, we've planted a mix of plants. And, you know, I've gotten over caring if plants are native or exotic. It's just as long as they're the right plant for the right place, that they can grow in those conditions, and that's okay by me. So I've got a mix of dianellas, which are a native plant, the broad-leafed canna lily, which canna can be a weed in some places. It's also a food crop in some places. And bromeliads. Someone was throwing the bromeliads out. They didn't suit the style of his garden. So I said, yeah, hey, I have some bromeliads. The other thing is, it's really important to grow shade, and choosing the right tree for the right place for the future is a really important thing to do. I published a blog about this recently, particularly for people in Canberra, about 7 climate-ready trees for Canberra. So that's something worthwhile having a look at. So in our outdoor oasis or outdoor haven, one of the plants we've chosen to use is the tuckaroo, which is an evergreen native rainforest tree but grows really well in our coastal area. It's to the northwest. We've actually just built a courtyard. So when I put this, not a courtyard, sorry, a pergola. When I was putting this presentation together, I was fiddling around with one of the photo shop type applications, not very well, mind you, and just gave you the idea of creating a pergola to the space. But the idea is, because we're in a temperate area, the winter sun is incredibly important. So we want to allow the winter sun into our courtyard, and we'll but also shade it in summertime. So we'll be planting that up with a deciduous grape. And I've included the image down below from the Kayo project, just because this beautiful example of fitting a tree into a setting. If you're going to use a tree like this, a Japanese maple, please choose a sheltered courtyard, protect it from hot, drying winds, and make sure you can keep the plant well watered. So if you're going to be planting densely, it's going to mean you're going to need a lot of plants. And one of the ways I keep up my plant addiction is I grow a lot of my own. So a lot of deciduous plants like this bottom left example, pomegranates and mulberries you can grow from cuttings. Also salvias down the bottom I grow from cuttings. But I also collect seed. So you can see me holding a tray of shrubs and trees. This is a mix of casuarinas. I found a casuarina growing just up the creek from us. I thought, well, that's going to grow really well on my block too. So I collected some seed. I was actually surprised how quickly the seed dried out, and I just used some seed raising mix and they propagated really readily. But also found outside the local cemetery, completely unirrigated, was a beautiful looking paperbuck. So I gathered some of that seed, and you can see me holding those plants there. So if you don't own your own home, or you're renting, or you're living in a courtyard like this one here where there is no soil, you may want to think about growing your outdoor haven in containers. But there's a number of rules you're going to need to follow if you're using containers. So the first one is as big a pot as possible. So for example, if you're growing edible plants that also create shade like fig or mulberry, I'd be recommending, so for example, this fig's probably 1.6 metres tall, and it's in a pot, a 400 millimetres pot. It's already really root bound. It's going to need to be potted up into the next size, say a 500 ml pot, but really you need big scale pots. Be aware that you can hurt your back moving big pots, so you might need to think carefully about you know, how you move them and who helps you do those. The other thing is, if you're potting, you've got to be out, buy the best potting mix you can afford. So look for a potting mix with ticks on the side. So that's the Australian standard. And also in summer, your pots will dry out really readily. So if you group your pots, that will help them. But you may, during heat waves, need to water them twice a day. And also be aware that potting mix can become quite hydrophobic. That means it dries out. So you may think you've watered your pot, so the water's gone in and come out, but it actually hasn't sat there. So if you scratch away the surface and it's still dry, you're going to need to soak that pot in a big container of water so all the soil re-wets itself. Here's an example of a project that I received grant money from the City Renewal Authority. This is to create climate-ready edible microforest in Braddon on Lonsdale Street. We're going to be using 2 wicking beds from Biofilter and going to plant them with edible plants. The wicking beds basically have a water reservoir at the bottom of that pot, and in each module, which is about 1 by 1 metre by about 315 millimetres high, they hold 110 litres of water. So this is a really great way in the future to be growing edible plants, say in public spaces or even private spaces, but making sure you have water there. So by having that well in the bottom, it really extends how long you can go without having to be applying water to these spaces. So hopefully this will get installed in spring 2020. Here's the example of the wicking bed in place. And I also talked about nourishing. So these outdoor spaces should be spaces that nourish you and your household and your pets, but also think about the wildlife. So when I'm talking about nourishing, I'm thinking about how do you engage the senses. So, you know, the idea, we've got that cascade in our pond. You know, the sound of water is incredibly soothing. The sound of wind through the casuarinas is soothing. Get in tune with your outdoor landscape, and maybe that you have, you know, wind chimes, or find what's really nice for you. Leave your digital devices inside. Also think about your outdoor furniture. So much outdoor furniture is incredibly clunky and uncomfortable. So I really like natural fibres for clothing, but also natural things to sit on, like timber. You can't really get cane so much these days, but cane chairs used to be incredibly lovely. Maybe hammocks. You know, if hammocks are spread out far enough, this one was a bit curvy, they can be a nice place just to relax outdoors. And you'll find if you're creating densely planted, well irrigated spaces, you're going to get some really cool visitors. So some of the visitors we get that I really love are the eastern spinebill. So I find them hovering around our salvias. But even more excitedly, I came across two of these only on one occasion, these green carpenter bees. They're a big, heavy, bumbling bee that made heaps of noise, and that's really excited to find that I'm attracting something like that into my pretty new garden. And finally, in order to stay cool during heat waves, cook outdoors. So you don't need a fancy setup. You can use outdoor cooking equipment, camping equipment. I use a gas bottle and a burner because I like to cook things like stir fries. If you don't feel like cooking, think about creating a salad from the garden or making a cool meal like gazpacho. And, you know, it's really lovely being outside on those hot nights and, you know, just trying to cool down and stay sane. Look, I hope you've enjoyed that. I am running a series of classes that start on July 1st about how to design your cool outdoor haven. So you can find that link below, so climatefactory.com.au learn. Thanks very much. Bye.